You were born with your left leg twisted inward, shorter than your right, the foot turned at an unnatural angle. Your parents saw it immediately. You could see the look that passed between them: fear, disappointment, shame. You were their fourth child, born in a small village in England in 1828, and from that first moment you were marked as different, as less. Your mother cried while the midwife wrapped you. Your father said nothing, just walked out of the room. As you grew, the reality of what your disability meant became clearer. You couldn't walk properly. You limped badly, dragging your twisted leg, using a stick for support. The other children called you names: cripple, gimp, monster. Their parents didn't stop them. Some of those parents looked at you with pity, others with disgust. A few whispered that your disability was God's punishment for some sin, either yours or your parents'. You couldn't go to school because the walk was too far and you couldn't keep up. You couldn't work in the fields like your siblings because you couldn't stand for long periods. You couldn't do most jobs because they required mobility you didn't have. You were a burden. Your parents never said it directly, but you felt it every day in the way they looked at you, in the extra food your siblings got while your portions were smaller, in the fact that when money was tight, you were the one who went without. This was life for disabled people in historical societies: not accommodation, not support, not recognition of your humanity, just rejection. Just being seen as defective, as cursed, as less worthy of life than everyone else. And knowing that society had decided you were worthless before you'd even had a chance to prove otherwise. Throughout most of human history, disabled people were viewed as cursed, punished by God, or simply defective and without value. There were no wheelchairs, no prosthetics, no accommodations. If you couldn't walk, you crawled or were carried. If you were blind, you begged. If you were deaf, you were assumed to be intellectually disabled because you couldn't speak. If you had any visible disability, you were marked as other, as less than fully human. Society had no place for you except the margins, begging on streets, living in the worst poverty, dependent on whatever scraps of charity people chose to give. And that charity was minimal and conditional. It came with moral judgment, with the assumption that your disability was somehow your fault or God's punishment. Churches preached that suffering built character, that disability was a test of faith. But they offered little practical help. Disabled people couldn't work most jobs, couldn't marry because who would want them, couldn't have children because they were seen as passing on their defects. They were isolated, invisible, literally hidden away by families who were ashamed, locked in back rooms or attics where visitors wouldn't see them. Some were abandoned entirely, left at churches or workhouses or simply on the streets to survive however they could. And most didn't survive long. The combination of poverty, lack of medical care, lack of support, and society's active hostility killed them young. Being disabled in the past meant living on the absolute edge of survival, one step from death, always, with no hope of anything better. Margaret Hastings was born in 1828 in Yorkshire with a clubfoot. Her left foot was twisted inward, making it impossible to walk normally. In that era, there was no corrective surgery, no physical therapy, no braces or supports that actually worked. You were born with a disability and you lived with it. Margaret's family was working class. Her father was a weaver. They had 6 children. Margaret was the youngest. Her disability made her a problem from the start. She couldn't help with household work the way her sisters could, couldn't walk to market, couldn't stand for long periods to cook or clean. She tried, she wanted to contribute, but her twisted foot meant that even simple tasks took twice as long and left her in pain. Her father was frustrated. He hoped for another healthy child who could eventually work and contribute to the family income. Instead, he had Margaret, a mouth to feed who couldn't earn her keep. He never hid his disappointment. Would compare her to her siblings, say things like, "If only you were normal," or "Why couldn't you be born right?" Margaret internalized every word, believed she was a failure, believed her disability was a personal moral failing rather than a medical condition. The other children in the village were cruel. They'd mock Margaret's limp, imitate her walk and laugh, call her names. Sometimes they'd trip her deliberately, watch her fall, and laugh harder. Adults rarely intervened. Many shared the belief that disabled children were somehow less deserving of protection. Margaret learned to avoid other children, to stay home as much as possible, but home wasn't safe either. Her siblings resented her, saw her as getting special treatment even though the reality was she got less food, fewer clothes, and constant criticism. They'd complain when they had to help her with tasks she couldn't do alone, would tell her she was useless. Margaret had no allies, no one who saw her as a full person. She was just the crippled one. Her entire identity reduced to her disability. By age 10, Margaret had stopped hoping things would get better, had accepted that this was all her life would ever be. Isolation, shame, being a burden people resented. She didn't dream about the future because she understood she had no future, just more of the same until she died. Hopefully soon, though she wouldn't say that out loud. Wishing for death was a sin, but living was so painful that death seemed like relief. Margaret tried to find work when she was 12. Her family needed the income, but no one would hire a girl with a clubfoot. Domestic service required being on your feet all day. Factory work required mobility. Farm work was impossible. Few people who even considered her would look at her foot, shake their heads, and turn her away. Some were polite, others were blunt. "I need workers, not cripples." Margaret heard that or variations of it dozens of times. Each rejection confirmed what she already knew: she was worthless. Society had no use for her. She couldn't contribute, couldn't earn, couldn't justify her own existence. She stayed home, did what little work she could, tried to be invisible so her family would resent her less. But invisibility was impossible. Her disability was visible. Every time she walked, every time she moved, it was obvious. She couldn't hide what she was, couldn't pretend to be normal. She was marked, permanently, irrevocably, and everyone who saw her knew it. If you were Margaret, living in a world that saw you as defective and worthless, rejected by employers, mocked by peers, resented by family, with no hope of independence or acceptance, how would you have survived psychologically? What would you have told yourself to get through each day? Disabled people who couldn't work and had no family support ended up in workhouses or on the streets. Workhouses were horrific for everyone, but especially for disabled people. The work required was physical labor that disabled people often couldn't do. But if you couldn't work, you didn't eat, or you got minimal rations that were barely enough to survive. Disabled people in workhouses were often the first to die when food was scarce or disease swept through. They were already weak, already vulnerable, already at the bottom of the hierarchy, and workhouse staff showed no mercy. Couldn't work meant couldn't eat. That was the rule. Many disabled people simply starved in workhouses because the labor required was impossible for their bodies. Margaret's family threatened to send her to the workhouse multiple times, usually when money was especially tight or when her father was angry. Margaret lived in terror of that threat. She'd heard stories, knew what workhouses were like, knew she probably wouldn't survive there, so she tried harder, pushed through pain, did work her body couldn't really handle, made herself useful however she could, just to avoid being sent away. The constant fear was exhausting, every day wondering if this would be the day her family decided she wasn't worth keeping. But here's what makes the treatment of disabled people in history even more cruel. Society created their suffering, the poverty, the isolation, the inability to work. These weren't inevitable consequences of disability. They were consequences of a society that refused to accommodate, that saw disabled people as less than human and treated them accordingly. If society had created jobs disabled people could do, if families had been supported to care for disabled members, if medical care had been available, if disabled people had been valued as human beings with dignity and worth, their lives would have been completely different. But society chose not to do those things, chose to see disability as a curse, chose to abandon disabled people, and then blamed them for their poverty and suffering. Called them burdens, called them useless, justified neglect and abuse by saying they were less than fully human. The cruelty was systematic, deliberate, a choice society made over and over to exclude and harm an entire category of people. And that choice killed millions of disabled people throughout history, through poverty, through neglect, through despair that led to suicide, through the diseases and injuries that able-bodied people could survive but disabled people couldn't because they had no resources or support. Think about being treated as less than human because your body works differently. Being denied work, denied dignity, denied the chance to live independently, not because you're incapable, but because society refuses to accommodate you. Being told your suffering is your own fault or God's will. Would you have survived that? Would you have wanted to? Most disabled people in the past died young. The combination of poverty, lack of medical care, and society's neglect was fatal. Margaret made it to 19. She spent her entire life in her family's home, doing whatever work she could, living with constant pain from forcing her disabled foot to bear weight it couldn't properly support. She'd never had friends. Never been courted by anyone because who would want to marry a cripple? Never had any kind of independence or joy. Just 19 years of existing as a burden in a family that resented her and a society that saw her as defective. At 19, Margaret developed a cough. It got worse over several weeks. Turned into pneumonia. Her family couldn't afford a doctor, wouldn't have called one anyway for Margaret. She wasn't worth the expense. She lay in bed, her breathing labored, her body burning with fever. Her mother gave her water occasionally. No one else checked on her. Margaret knew she was dying, and part of her was relieved. Finally, it would be over. The pain, the shame, the constant awareness that she didn't belong, that she was a mistake, an error, something that should never have existed. Margaret died on a cold morning in November. She was 19 years old. She'd never had a single day where she felt valued or loved. Never had a moment where someone saw her as a full person rather than a disability. Her last conscious thought was wondering if anyone would be sad she was gone, and knowing the answer was no. They'd be relieved. One less mouth to feed, one less reminder of their shame. Margaret's body was buried in the churchyard in an unmarked grave. Her family couldn't afford a headstone, didn't think she needed one. She'd barely existed in life. Why mark her existence in death? Within a year, her siblings barely remembered her. She became a vague memory, the crippled one who died. That's all she was to them, all she'd ever been. Her life had mattered so little that her absence made almost no difference. That was the cruelest truth. She lived 19 years and left no mark, no impact, no memory, just gone, as if she'd never been born. Which is probably what her family wished had been the case. The treatment of disabled people throughout history reveals the darkest aspects of human nature. The willingness to see some people as less than others. The willingness to justify neglect and abuse. The willingness to let people suffer and die when accommodation would have been possible. Margaret wasn't doomed by her clubfoot. She was doomed by a society that decided her clubfoot made her worthless. That's the real disability, not the physical condition, but the social response to it. The exclusion, the stigma, the active hostility. Disabled people were killed by society's choices, by the decision that they didn't deserve support or accommodation, that their lives had less value, that their suffering was acceptable or even deserved. And those decisions were made consciously, by people who could have chosen differently, who could have seen disabled people as fully human and deserving of dignity, but chose not to. Chose cruelty instead, chose to create systems that destroyed disabled people and then blamed them for being destroyed. Even as societies eventually began to change, to recognize disability rights, to create accommodations and support systems, those changes came far too late for the millions who'd already died. Margaret died in 1847, but disabled people were still being institutionalized against their will in the 1970s. Still being sterilized without consent, still being denied education, employment, basic rights. The fundamental attitude that disabled people are somehow less, that they're burdens, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps society chooses to give them, that attitude persisted for generations, persists still in many places, in every barrier that hasn't been removed, in every accommodation that has to be fought for, in every assumption that disabled people can't or shouldn't do things that able-bodied people take for granted. Margaret died believing she was worthless, that her disability made her less than human. Society taught her that, reinforced it every day of her short, painful life. And that teaching, that belief system that disabled lives matter less, is still being taught, still being reinforced, still killing people, maybe not as directly as it killed Margaret, but through neglect, through exclusion, through the message that disabled people are other, are less, are not fully part of society. Margaret deserved better. Every disabled person throughout history deserved better, deserved to be seen as complete human beings, deserved accommodation and support, deserved lives of dignity and possibility. They got none of that, got only suffering, only rejection, only the knowledge that society had decided they shouldn't exist and was willing to make that belief reality through systematic neglect and abuse. That's the truth of disability in historical societies. Not noble suffering, not inspiration, just cruelty, just the worst of human nature manifesting as policy and practice. And until we fully confront that truth, until we recognize that disability is a social construct as much as a physical reality, until we commit to never again treating disabled people as less than fully human, we're complicit in continuing Margaret's suffering. She died, but the system that killed her is still here, still operating, still deciding whose lives matter and whose don't. And that's unacceptable. Margaret deserved to live, deserved to be valued, deserved to know that her life mattered. She never got that. We owe her and all the forgotten disabled people throughout history the commitment to ensure that future generations do get it, that no one else has to die believing they're worthless because of how their body works. That's justice. That's humanity. That's what we owe to Margaret and everyone like her, and it's long overdue.